Okay, so hello everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Galen Wattts. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Waterloo and also an associate director of the Institute for Religion, Culture, and Societal Futures. I'm really excited to be hosting this, our third of this third event of this term. It'll be our last as well, before we take a break for the summer. And so we have a really special speaker for you today, who I will introduce. So we have with us, joining virtually, of course, Dr. Paul Bramadat. So Paul is a professor of religious studies at the University of Victoria, where he's also the director of the Center for Religion and Society. And his research concerns broadly religion, spirituality, and secularity in North America and Western Europe. And he's published a number of articles and books in these areas. So just to list a few. So his first book, The Church on the World's Turf, examined the ways religious subcultures can thrive in largely secular environments. A more recent book, published in 2017 with the U of T Press, was titled Public Health in the Age of Anxiety, Religious and Cultural Roots of Vaccine Hesitancy in Canada. And then even more recently, he was the co-editor with Patricia O'Connell-Killen, as well as our very own Sarah Wilkins-Laflamme, of a book titled Religion at the Edge, Nature, Spirituality, and Secularity in the Pacific Northwest. But most recently, Paul has been doing research on modern postural yoga in North America. He's himself a practitioner. And so he has written this book, Yogalands in Search of Practice on the Mat and in the World, which was just published with McGill Queen's University Press. And I think he's going to speak about that book today. I'm really excited. I've started reading it. I haven't finished it, but I've been enjoying it a lot so far. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it over to you, Paul.
Wonderful. Thanks very much, Galen. Is my audio okay? Sounds good.
Right, yeah.
All right, great. All right, thanks everybody. I'm so happy to be here with you. I'm just really excited to see what Sarah and Galen are doing at Waterloo, and nice to see some familiar faces on the screen. So I'm going to give you a bit of a sense of what the book is about. I'll also note that there's going to be an author meets critics panel at the CSSR in Toronto in May. I think David's chairing that. So come out for that if you want to have a sense of the kind of critical response to it. So let me first, let me see if what, okay. Let me give you some sense of what I'm hoping to do today. I want to introduce the book. And this book is one of many of the CSRS, Center for Studies in Religion and Society's major book projects funded by SSHRC. So I want to kind of give you a bit of a sense of the book, its place in the CSRS, academic ecosystem. Of course, part of my long game, since I'm still the director of the CSRS, is to entice all of you to come to the center. Sarah's been there, David's been there, quite a few have been there or had something to do with it, but it's a good place to get work done and to meet folks you wouldn't otherwise meet. And so we can talk a little bit about that. And then I want to maybe open up some, sort of introduce you to some issues that I deal with in the book that might be of interest to people in religious studies and sociology of religion. Though I think this book kind of spans a number of different fields and disciplines, one of which is religious studies. That's a natural one, of course, but sociology of religion, maybe anthropology of religion. There's a little bit of political science in there, I guess, but you'll have a sense of what I'm up to by the end of my roughly 30 minutes or so. So before I started doing this, as Galen mentioned, I had a number of other interests. In some sense, I started studying fundamentalist Christianity and undergrads. Then I started to look at public policy, multiculturalism, and so on. Then 9/11. So Lauren Dawson and I did a book on radicalization and securitization. And then I sort of turned to the ways in which you might say religious or spiritual communities or ideas are kind of managed within public health settings. So we did a book on vaccines, end of life care, and then I started looking at kind of religion in the public arena, so urban religious events. And then I got interested in regionalism, so the weird ways in which the place you're living actually seems to impact the ways in which people think about and practice religious, spiritual, post-spiritual practices. Um, and then, so this interest in the body and regions and nations and spiritual movements, in some sense, turned me toward yoga. That seems like an almost logical story, but the story actually begins in a pretty broken down 45-year-old white collar, stressed out, type A, uh, bad male choices body. So when I was around 45, I had a fairly sudden flare up of very debilitating arthritis in my knees. And my doctor basically said, your life is now not over, but you're never going to run again or play soccer or do anything that you enjoy again. He is a pretty cool young doctor. He just looked in his toolkit mentally when he saw my X-rays and the report from the radiologist and just said, no, this is serious. And I said, well, what about yoga? And I sort of listed a number of things that I thought might be other ways of treating this pain I was experiencing. And he said, basically those things are super expensive, not very well supported by evidence. And in any event, you're definitely going to need, new knees and serious pain medication for the next 10, 15 years. Anyway, long story short, a colleague of mine at the center who was an elite athlete, he said, well, why don't you try yoga? And I did not want to be that guy who came from central Canada, kind of normal Canada, who crossed the mountains and, bought a kayak, got a tattoo, changed my name, became a vegan. I just didn't want to be that guy. I was meeting some of them out here, but I thought, nah, I'm not really, I'm kind of a prairie kind of, anyway, I just thought that's not going to be working for me. But I thought this guy was an elite athlete and he had a body of a kind of a Greek god. And I thought, oh, I'll try it. If it's okay for him, it might be okay for me. And I tried it and it totally changed everything and fairly quickly, actually. So that, initially for me, yoga was kind of, I think of it as sort of Indic physiotherapy. The way this guy convinced me to try it is because I said, look, you know what? All I do all day, every day is think about, talk about, write about religion and spirituality. I would like my physiotherapy to be kind of uninvolved in that sort of thing. And he said, don't worry, this kind of yoga is not like that. It's going to be really good for your body. Trust me. I trusted him. And, when my knees were fixed and I could actually walk my dogs around the block because it was getting that bad. Once everything was fixed, I thought, well, maybe I'll just stop now, but it kind of it sort of began to have its grip on my body. And I got kind of curious then to keep practicing. And also then I got curious about the ways in which my academic training might somehow have something to say about this thing I was seeing. And then you start scratching the surface, and anybody who's studied Asian traditions will know that there is an entire kind of substratum of philosophy, texts, traditions that come together and express itself somewhat rhizomatically in modern postural yoga. So I couldn't really avoid it anymore, and I decided I would actually start reading and thinking about yoga. And so that's resulted in this, which is now out. I think its official publication date was April 8th. It's kind of been sort of circulating a little bit before that, but it's officially now out in the world with McGill Queens. And the McGill Queens has been just so wonderful to work with. I feel very fortunate to be able to work with them. They allowed me to put 25 high-res pictures in the book, which has really been a wonderful thing. So every time in the book I make a reference to a posture or an asana, as we call them, I make sure at some point near that reference, there's a picture of somebody doing that posture. And I was able to use two of my teachers from my studio as the models for this photo shoot. So now I should, this is not a direct quote from the book, but I realized that actually I needed to kind of articulate what I mean by Yogalands as a kind of a category. So for me, I mean, it's a transnational space in which students and teachers move and practice. I think it names really a subculture and an ethos with a distinctive sort of feel to it, with familiar smells and tastes. It has key figures some of them you could think of as saint-like, others who are just sort of celebrities. It has key rituals, the TT, the teacher training program that many people have gone through, either to become teachers or just to become more serious practitioners. This is you talked about in every yoga space. It's got kind of workshops, there's like a workshop scene where people will often go to resorts to do the workshops, or the workshops will happen in studios. You're typically expected, or it's assumed that you would go to India at some point to further your studies. It's got key sites in India, so Goa, Rishikesh, Mysore, Pune, Wanderlust, outside of India, of course. Um, but even part of what I'm arguing is that even when we're talking about studios in Detroit or Halifax or Hamilton or wherever, or even spaces that are kind of set aside in your own home, and that are kind of demarcated by, usually people will try to have a space that's clean, orderly. Sometimes they might have candles. There's a variety of ways people mark off space as sort of separate and sacred. I think these are actually also part of Yogalands. And so it's a kind of a imagined community and an imagined geography. Now, the project at a glance, this is one of my teachers and one of the pictures in the book. Um, So it's funded by Shirk. I've been doing it since 2022. I think maybe it's a 5-year grant or a 4-year grant. I can't remember. Um, it allowed me to go out into the field. I went to seven cities. So Victoria, Vancouver, LA, Winnipeg, Indianapolis, Toronto, and New York. I basically paired the cities, and I'll tell you why in a second. Los Angeles and Vancouver, Toronto and New York, Winnipeg and Indianapolis. And Victoria was kind of I did as a sort of proof of concept pilot project about a year before a year before I got the Shirk. I kind of did a dry run of what these interviews and field visits might look like. So pretty decent N. I had 83 formal structured interviews, range between, I don't know, hour and a half, 2 hours, was pretty common. Even though officially you could finish in 45 minutes, but pretty much as soon as we started the interviews, people wanted to talk and talk and talk. And so we just let them. It was pretty wonderful. 34 informal interviews. So these are, I'm assuming they're kind of some method and theory nerds in this call. So, by informal interviews, I really just mean interviews that kind of occurred in foyers of yoga studios where the RA and I would deal with all the questions, but it wasn't officially consent formed. But we still hid the identities. We did focus groups and tons of participant observation. Part of what we were curious about was sort of the yoga scene in each of these cities, including are the yoga studios all in the suburbs? Is it really hard to get to them? Are they in basements, in high rises, in houses? Are they in temples? Kind of trying to get a sense of the vibe of these places. We did a pretty wide range of yoga styles in our 65 classes. Did a survey, thanks to Sarah for some initial. I touched as everyone should in Canada. I initially touched base with Sarah about good ways to do this, and which is not to say she's to blame for anything, but just to say that she was helpful. And Chris Miller helped in the end. Pardon me. Chris Miller helped in the end make sure that we could overcome a crisis that we were having with the PhD student in sociology here that we got to help us deal with the numbers that we were getting. And Chris rode in on his white horse and saved the day. Absolutely. So the survey is of American and Canadian practitioners. So on the one hand, we have the sort of in-depth visits to cities, and then we have the survey that is North America wide. Everyone kept talking about the TTs, the teacher training experience, so I decided I better go do one of them because I think anthropologically that's the right move. They're super expensive, but thankfully I was able to pay for it with my grant. So I'm now officially I have a RYT 200 certification, whatever that might mean. But I did that here. That was pretty. Turns out 200 hours is a lot more hours than you think. Anyway, I've been teaching off and on since 2023, usually once or twice a week. And that's been quite wonderful. I teach kind of the basic level courses. Um, I've also been teaching an undergraduate course at UVic in kind of the sociology, anthropology, politics of yoga. It's in our religion and culture program here. I've been teaching that. I think I've taught it 4 times, I guess, and so that's been really good because I've had a class of I don't know 50 or 60 students every year, and that gives you some sense of how 20-year-olds are kind of managing these issues and what kind of yoga they like and don't like and how they approach these questions. I also have a fairly, I guess, semi-fanatical personal practice that I do since I've been doing since 2013, 6 days a week. So I drive to a studio downtown, and it's about 90 minutes, 90 minutes a session. I won't bore you with the Ashtanga model, but you kind of go in and it's self-practice with which is overseen by a senior teacher. And I've been pretty involved in the AAR yoga studies world for many years, and I practice whenever I'm abroad. Some more background. Oh yeah, so the pictures throughout today's presentation are the pictures of the two models whose pictures are featured in the book, and then these are just me, just to mix it up. Also, maybe relevant. Well, I mean, it's relevant as far as the book is concerned. I come out of a mixed race background, and in the book, my father's of Indo Trinidadian background, and so this has been a kind of a fact of my life growing up, and I integrate that fact into my reflections because it kind of mattered when I was doing the interviews that I had a unusual last name, that I had a half Indian backstory. That sort of positioned me differently in the broader conversation. Genre, I mean, it's one of the benefits. I think several people on the screen will maybe agree. One of the benefits of being a full professor and being not a young professor anymore is that you can make certain choices about your writing style and the imagined audience that you wouldn't make when you're 36. So it's, I mean, it's a religious studies slash, pop culture slash sociology, anthropology text, I suppose. But there's a fair bit of memoir and storytelling, and there's a fair amount of poetry in the book as well. So I kind of gave myself permission to maybe not follow the sort of, normal guidelines I would have followed for most of my career, and that I think that is adding to its to the warm reception it's getting. I had two great research assistants. Leah Berman is a PhD student in anthropology at UVic. I'm one of her supervisors. And Rachel Brown, who is the recently appointed director of the CSRS, was at this time she was an RA, and so she joined me on one of these fieldwork trips. So I mentioned the political science angle because actually initially what I was most interested in and what took me into the field and what I wrote into the Shirk was that I was interested in whether or not postural yoga might look different in the United States than it does in Canada. That was my principal curiosity. In other words, if we think of yoga, especially the kind of the yogas we'd find in North America, if we think of them as becoming increasingly commodifiable, increasingly perhaps common from city to city, would that still be the case when we were seeing American and Canadian societies move in different directions? This was during the Trump and Trudeau era. So that was what I initially, took into the field, thinking that when I would go to these sister cities, so Toronto, New York, LA, Vancouver, and Winnipeg and Indianapolis, then maybe I would hear Americans speaking very, very differently about gun control, women's freedom, immigration, whatever. Maybe I thought maybe that would influence the way yoga looked in these spaces, and I did. I did find some of that, some of those kind of, I guess I would say, national or regional differences, but it wasn't anywhere as grippy as I expected it to be, right? So as many of you know, you go out into the field sometimes thinking you're going to be pursuing, angle X, and people just don't really seem to be all that interested in what you thought was going to be really top of mind for them. So it wasn't all that grippy. in some ways, Sarah will recognize this because when we went out into the field thinking about the Cascadia region, a lot of the folks out here aren't really even that interested in talking about spirituality as a standalone thing, which they juxtapose with religion in quite the same way. And so that and it, required us, I think, to think a bit more creatively about what's happening in Cascadia. So similarly with this project, um, I felt I needed to pivot a little bit and think about different fault lines in Yogaland, especially really the fragile body in a hostile world. That became kind of the dominant theme because that's what people kept talking about. We would go and we'd ask questions about Trump and Trudeau and healthcare and all that, and they'd have answers, and the answers would be good, and the answers are in the book and in the survey. But people were way more interested in talking about their own bodies and their own what brought them to yoga and how what this is doing to them and how this thing they do every week or every day is responding to the broader world in which they live. And they didn't think of the border as being all that relevant, and the border didn't seem to be as relevant as I expected. So that became kind of the through line that I sensed. Um, so just very briefly, what's the structure of the book? I start with an introduction. I have the first chapter, the first full chapter is really a chapter on politics. Kind of when we think about yoga, whether it is or should be political or should not be political. That's a very common claim to hear in yoga studios is that yoga has nothing to do with religion or yoga has nothing to do with politics. So in the first chapter, I deal with this question of is yoga political? Should it be political? Has it ever been political? What does it mean to be political? And then I talk about religionish, which is sort of uh, just a cute way of giving the chapter a title that allows me to enter into the question of the SBNR nature of religion, of yoga, because everybody in yoga spaces will say, "Look, yoga is spiritual, but not religious," and they'll literally say this while standing right in front of a statue of Ganesh, right before they're about to give a class where they use tons of Sanskrit. So there's a variety of ways in which I want to just sort of ask people like what they mean by that. And so then that allows me to get into issues that I think religious studies scholars would find interesting. Third chapter is really about all the trauma stories that we kept hearing. Of course, we all know about the idea of the body keeps the score, classic book by Bessel van der Kolk. In this chapter, I make the argument that modern postural yoga in North America is an illustration of the way the body can be used to settle the score. And in Bessel van der Kolk's book, he does have a chapter on yoga, but it's the weakest chapter in the book by a very wide margin. Because in 2013, when he published the book, there wasn't really much to say about the sort of science of yoga or about, the question of yoga and medicine. There's a bit more to say now. It's not definitive, but there's a bit more to say now. And then in the fourth chapter, I talk about super people or Jivan Muktas, people who are kind of the sort of stars of the yoga world, including the people that you're seeing in these pictures, people who sort of have this magical physical quality, this kind of physical charisma. And then I talk about the two scandals that I thought were going to be that many people thought, well, this might end yoga, the debates around cultural appropriation, which of course were very big debates in maybe 10 or 15 years ago. And of course, the Me Too movement. Yoga had a big Me Too problem, to put it mildly, has had for a long time, frankly, but certainly with the actual Me Too movement, it really, it really became kind of the central challenge. Um, and then I have a conclusion. Then I have also an afterword, and it's in the afterword that I talk about kind of future research projects that might come out of the book. So I'm just going to give you a sneak peek into one chapter because I notice it's 11:56, and so or at least it is here. So I don't want to have to rush too much. But so chapter one, which is really about the question of politics. And in that book, in that chapter, I'll just read a portion of it. At the beginning of many postural yoga classes, teachers often ask students to stand at the front of their mats with eyes shut and hands at heart center, so that everyone in the class can synchronize their breath, chant Om, and recite an invocation in Sanskrit. Students are often encouraged to Breathe in peace, exhale release. Teachers might explain these ritualized actions as ways to, quote, center yourselves, take a break from your regular lives, be at peace with your body, set an intention, give yourselves the privilege of attending to your own needs for the next hour, and so forth. The scenes described above will be familiar to anyone who has ever entered the utopian alternative space of, I think, the space that I think of as Yogaland. Whether I'm practicing in Barcelona, Sydney, Victoria, New York, Göttingen, Waterloo, or Winnipeg, I know that the owners, managers, and teachers have gone to great lengths to make sure that I am extracted from my regular life and ushered into a new world. The studio is an anti-world in the sense that it subverts an outside world that is often experienced as too loud, fast, and dirty. These anti-worlds create what anthropologist Sarah Strauss calls oasis regimes, or alternatives to one's normal life. Of course, elements of the outside world continue to influence these quiet, slow, clean spaces, but for now it's just important to note that these spaces are designed to allow practitioners to escape. So in this chapter, I suggest that postural yoga is, and arguably has always been, inherently political. In fact, the most common political feature of postural yoga is its promise to offer an escape from a loud, fast, and dirty world. But even though many practitioners evade political questions on the mat and in studios, politics follow them there. And so in the chapter, I go through what you might think of as I sort of describe a spectrum from, to use yogic terms, from gross to subtle, from the kind of ordinary ways that we think of politics. So Narendra Modi, for example, often uses yoga as part of his campaign to convince Muslims that they don't really belong in India, that they're not proper Indians if they don't do yoga. So that's kind of the sort of gross, the sort of material end of the spectrum. I also talk about the scandal in British Columbia, where Christy Clark got herself into big trouble when she tried to have what she thought would be the largest international day of yoga event on the bridge, one of the Burrard Street Bridge, and it just failed miserably and very quickly. And then, but I go all the way to thinking about lawsuits in the United States, where questions around yoga in prisons and yoga in schools becomes kind of a hot topic because it's many people would argue that this is sort of stealth Hinduism. And there have been all kinds of interesting legal cases around that. But I think actually the more interesting way to think about yoga's political fact or yoga's political influence is to think about it as an implicit critique of the loud, fast, dirty world that yoga gives you a bit of a break from. So this one I'll just talk you through rather than give you a reading sample, just in the interest of time. So in this, if you go to yoga studios, you see people like this. This is one of my teachers, who seem to be able to do anything they feel like with their bodies. They can put their legs behind their head and still have a conversation with you. They can balance in one hand for, it seems like an hour. They're my teachers. They are very gifted, and they are central to the yoga, to the fact and popularity of yoga, in my view. They're central in the same way I think that, you can't really understand the spread and popularity of Christianity without thinking about martyrs and saints. I think without these kinds of rock stars of Christianity, you don't really have this sort of, I mean, it's nice that Constantine decided it would be the disk operating system of the empire, but I think it's crucial that you have these sort of heroic figures who seem to be able to have special access to God. And in the yoga world, I think we have these people too. And I think, almost every studio has one or two of them who seem to have no limits of any kind. So this woman and the other teacher you saw can stand up, bend over backwards, and put their hands on their calves, and then just stand up from that without any help. Even that's in the book too. And so in this chapter, what I do is I try to figure out, what is the role of these sort of super people, Jivan Muktas, which means liberated while living. That's the Sanskrit root of it. What is the significance of these super people within Yogalands? And I make sense of it in two ways. So in the Yoga Sutras, which if you go to any yoga studio and there are even just two books in that studio, the two books will be the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita. They might have more books, but these will be the two books you'll find most commonly. And the Yoga Sutras is an ancient text, and it is a very dense text, but actually short if you just read the sutras themselves. The commentaries are longer, but the actual sutras are short. Many people who start a yoga practice buy these texts thinking, well, they're short, I can read them on the bus. And they read them and they're just impossibly dense. They don't really make a lot of sense without commentaries. And most people get turned off after the first two padas or two chapters. But throughout, like as the Yoga Sutras go on to the all the way to the final chapter, there's a ton of special gifts or special powers that advanced yoga practitioners are promised. So I'm talking about invisibility, shape-shifting, mind reading, time travel, um, being able to know the time and date of your death and the space and the organization of the planets. I mean, these are, and being able to read minds and so forth. So these are very elaborate, very exciting special powers that the idea is that, hey, look, you know, you have to think about the matrix, right? Once you realize the matrix isn't real, you can just pretty much do anything with your body. It's sort of like that kind of level of promise that's made. And yet, you'll almost never hear people talk about these special powers. These special powers, by the way, in the Yoga Sutras are mentioned maybe 30 times as often as physical postures are mentioned. Physical postures, the kind that she's doing, aren't mentioned at all, literally at all in the Yoga Sutras or in the Bhagavad Gita. So it's kind of weird that in the two texts that show up in almost every studio have almost nothing to say about the kind of thing that my teacher is doing here. So I was trying to figure that out. Like, you know, if you think about the Bible and you think about some of the trippier parts of the Bible, so Revelation and Daniel, for example, um, the Yoga Sutras promises are trippy like that. And that's perhaps one of the reasons people don't mention them because they kind of freak people out. Um, so in some sense, part of my argument in this chapter is that, you know, these very elaborate, very dramatic special powers that people are promised are kind of sublimated. People can't really, like ordinary practitioners like me, can't like it just doesn't really make sense to think about invisibility and shape shifting and taking on you know, knowing the thoughts of other people. It doesn't really make sense. And so they emphasize the postures rather than these special powers. But there's a way in which these promises are there. They exist kind of on the periphery, on the edges of Yogaland, and they come into being in the bodies of people like my friend here. Her name is Kimber, and so that's one thing. The other thing, of course, is just Weber's charisma. There's a way in which certain people have special powers, or special powers are attributed to them, or they just actually have special powers innate in them, and that there's a way in which these special figures, these super people or Jivan Muktas, are kind of these quintessential combinations, concatenations, really, of beauty, prowess, and charisma. But they are in some ways a modern evocation of the promises that are promised in Yoga Sutras. So just by way of, I mentioned earlier that I do include a fair bit of poetry when it's useful in the book, and I think it's sometimes useful. And there's this beautiful poem called Bonfire Opera, in which the author, the poet, is talking about watching this older woman really at ease with her body and just feeling this sense of awe and joy in watching this woman walk around and swim in the ocean. In Bonfire Opera, the American poet Danusha Lamaris captures the experience that many of us have as we try to make peace with, sense of, and shapes with our fragile, yearning bodies. The speaker in this poem reflects on an aging woman seemingly at peace in her own body. The speaker admires the older woman, yet sees as well that this appearance of equanimity was not the hymn of promise, but the body's bright wailing against its limits, a bird caught in a cathedral, the way it tries to escape by throwing itself again and again against the stained glass. Now, most comprehensive religious, spiritual, and intellectual accounts of the world promise to provide an escape for that bird so it's allowed to exit the building and to fly finally free. It won't remain free forever. It'll get hungry, it'll raise a family, its flying abilities will decline, and it will be terrorized by predators and forest fires. It'll learn that buildings are cages, but still it will seek shelter among other birds. So, what's this story doing here toward the end of a book in an otherwise sober account of future research directions I or others might pursue? I suppose I want to make sure to observe that a serious yoga practice resembles serious Buddhist, Christian, or Muslim practices in that these religious ways of knowing, moving, thinking, and being reflect an abiding urge to be free. The challenge is that whether one is a curious critic or a devoted practitioner, modern postural yoga communities reflect the core values, aesthetics, prejudices, and ideologies of the societies in which yoga has been embedded. That shouldn't come as a surprise since nothing we value, our countries, families, laws, and our most mundane habits, exists in a vacuum. Yoga might promise its practitioners radical freedom, and Jivan Muktas, or super people, might make asanas look effortless. But the postures, the people, and the places in which they meet are enmeshed in a broader world of samsara, the cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, that is exceedingly difficult to escape. Difficult, but some mornings on the mat in my studio, it seems not impossible to imagine that the bird might finally find a way into the sky beyond the stained glass. So that's just a piece of the conclusion chapter. Now let me just end by just sort of mentioning a few things that for me at least are unanswered, and that might be areas we can discuss or areas that I might pursue later. Although trans issues, when I was doing the field work, were front and center in the public conversation at universities, governments, etc. It was virtually absent from the conversations I would have with focus groups and with teachers and students. And I have an explanation for that, which I don't have time to provide right now, but it was a fascinating silence, especially given how central it was elsewhere. And I say it's fascinating because, after all, yoga spaces are spaces where we're talking about the body as a site of healing or transformation. So you sort of expect trans issues to come up. Indigenous and African American reconciliation types of questions were also really in the background. I would raise them in interviews and focus groups, and people would give the appropriate liberal progressive answers, but it was pretty clear they weren't that interested in connecting these questions of liberation to their yoga practice or their yoga communities. Also, I think questions around what happened to yoga during COVID, because the whole yoga economy changed dramatically. Lots of studios shut or combined. I think there's something to be thought about, to be looked at there. Around the question of sexuality and the sexual scandals that erupted in the yoga world in the last decade or so. I think yoga studios, the yoga community, got really good at catching monsters, really good at sort of saying, you have been a problem for a decade or 5 decades, you need to go. So there were lawsuits, there were all kinds of eruptions and suicides and so forth. So I think they've gotten pretty good at that. But what they're not very good at is talking about day-to-day, ordinary, complex feelings that people have when they're close to other people's bodies. So this is what I call the erotics of proximity. I don't think they're really good at that yet, and I think that's a thing to be thinking about in the future. From a religious studies scholar's perspective, the insider-outsider issue is of real interest to me. And I think that for me, this project was a kind of a meditation on what it might mean to think dispassionately about something one loves passionately. Of course, as a person of no fixed address religiously, whenever I would watch friends of mine who were Christians, like David or others, research Christian issues, I would think, well, thank goodness I don't have to worry about, squaring that circle. This was somebody else's problem, right? How people could be serious scholars of Christianity and still be Christians. But now this is kind of my problem. in a way that it's never really been my problem before. And that's been kind of interesting to kind of give myself to that dilemma and to feel myself in the middle of that problem in a way that I've never felt in the middle of before. Um, I think also, I have to say when I would go to conferences or just, potlucks or, anytime I would be in a social setting and someone would say, "Hey, so what do you do?" And I would say, I'm a professor, and you would try to avoid it, but eventually they would say, "Well, what's the topic you're researching?" And I would say, "Well, I'm interested in yoga," and immediately you would get this quick flip response or kind of an eye roll, and so I'm quite fascinated by the preconceptions people have about postural yoga that they immediately and quite comfortably share with you. Um, and that's fascinating, all the things that are already in the minds of people before I even say, this is my topic. And so, because that's a thing that a scholar of yoga has to battle against, is all the stuff that's already in there. And so yeah, so I was going to talk about what grad students, what this might teach grad students, but I think we're running out of time. Um, so future and related projects, I'll just mention two. Right now, I'm editing a book called We Should Know Better, which is a book that focuses specifically on the scholar practitioner identity or problem. So I brought together 17 Western trained scholars of religion, um, mostly white or like me, white passing, I guess. So all of us have been raised on Said and Assad and the critique of the critique offered of Western religions by feminists. So all of us kind of know how the sausage is made, let's say, and yet many of us still find ourselves drawn profoundly to Reiki, yoga, meditation, what Buddhism, whatever it might be. And some of us have some bad conscience about that, I guess I would say, or at least it's a thing we have to deal with. So the book is basically about that dilemma, and I brought together people from Spain and Australia and other places who are themselves, again, scholars trained in the West, but actually who have Asian practices that are personally important. And I think the next Geraldine and I will be doing some kind of a project related to differences between Quebec and British Columbia vis-a-vis kind of alternative, complementary, spiritually informed healthcare practices. And I may do a separate book on the body cells of score, on these kind of bodily practices that are kind of adjacent to healthcare norms and policies. So that's that. And this is me teaching. Uh, these are not normal students. These are all students sitting in full lotus, and these are all high functioning students. So, but the people at my studio took this picture and thought it was funny. So there you go. Okay, so that's it for me. Should I stop sharing?
Sure, that'd be great. Yeah, that's fine. Thanks so much, Paul. That was really fantastic and super interesting. Yeah, I really enjoyed that. Well, we do have some time now for questions, so I want to open it up to anybody out there. If you have a question, uh, feel free to either raise your hand virtually or actually, or put it in the chat. Ryan, please.
Sure. Thanks, Paul. This is really interesting. And I had to start by saying some of those photos. As a former dancer, I was like, I don't know how they got into those positions. I don't know how they're going to get out of those positions. It was kind of crazy to me, but like I appreciate seeing that. So thank
Yeah.
you. That was really interesting. Um, one of your chapters, I'm going to have to get the book, of course, but one of your chapters was titled Religionish. And I hate to admit this, but like I love and hate wrestling with definitions of religion, right? So I'm like I'm of mixed minds here. Can you give us just like a sampler of what you're getting at with that religionish idea, where you're going with this? I mean, I think I have an idea, but I'd like to know where you were headed with this religionish idea.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that chapter, I mean, you might find it entertaining, but it's not going to teach you a whole lot because that chapter is really, in some sense, aimed at the people who say this has nothing to do with religion. And again, they're standing right in front of Ganesh and they're about to essentially give a bit of a thumbnail sketp of Advaita Vedanta in their teaching of yoga. So what I do in that chapter is I talk about the ways in which religion is thought to work, thought to be, and how yoga is framed as an alternative to it. So, because I think actually it's still worthwhile to be thinking about the ways in which we as scholars of religion still ought to look at a yoga studio as a place where religion is being practiced, is being reimagined, being redeployed. And for insiders who might read the book, it's making an effort to say, like, pay attention to the various ways in which religion shows up all over the place here. And they're so allergic to the category of religion that they just say it's not here at all until I sort of point out in 15 different ways that you can't really get away from the category of religion when you're in a yoga space. And some spaces do better than others. I shouldn't say better. Some spaces make a real effort to to denude, to sort of pull out everything that feels like religion. But most of the places I was in, it's there. If you just sit there for a little while, you can hear it. You can see the tattoos. You can listen to the language that's used. You can spot it a mile away. So yeah, I'm trying to kind of think about what it is about religion that they find objectionable, and what it is that might still be there that is religious.
Thanks, Ryan. Why don't we move to Kathy?
Thanks a lot, Paul. This was a really interesting presentation. I'm looking forward to reading the book.
Thank you.
And I appreciate your kind of personal engagement with this. Thank you for that. I've been, interested in religion's impact on bodies. But a side thing for me has always been sort of religion's designation of some bodies as acceptable and other bodies as not acceptable. So I'm really curious because now I'm involved in a project with a colleague of mine who looks at weight stigma, and she's looking at religion and obesity and those kinds of things. And so I'm fascinated that the images that you've chosen are of particular kinds of thin bodies. And I kind of purposely, in my own sort of social media engagement with yoga people, have chosen yoga people with non-traditional and non-conforming yoga bodies. So do you get into that at all? Because I find that in the whole Yogalands stuff really fascinating. Like like as someone who will never have a conforming body. So do you address that at all?
Yeah, thanks, Kathy. That's a great question, and I definitely address it because it's super interesting to me. What is a yoga body? What is the yoga body? It put me in an awkward spot though, because the postures that I refer to in the book are often fairly difficult ones. Some of them you've seen in the samples I've given. And so the kind of people that I know who can actually do those postures, generally speaking, are extremely fit. And so the two women I chose can do all those postures, right? So that then became a bit of a dilemma, is that they're very photogenic. They definitely have the yoga body, sort of classic yoga body. And that's not unproblematic. And so in the book, I do talk about the stigmatization that many women, especially feel. Lots of people I know who say, well, I would love to practice yoga, but I need to lose some weight first. And you just think, well, what? I don't understand that. You know, it's like saying I'd really love to go to become a Christian, but I think I would like to become a better person first. It's like, well, okay. So yeah, I get into it. I talk about eating disorders. I talk about because that's definitely a thing. It's certainly in Ashtanga, it's definitely a thing. Yeah, so that's in there. By way of a case study of this issue, I sort of assumed that the person who designed the book cover would choose one of the 25 pictures that's in the book because they are very impressive pictures. And the folks at McGill Queens were really great. They just said, no, we don't want to foreground another pretty yoga starlet. And so what they did then is they took one of the pictures of the postures and they sort of stylized it. So that is a picture in the book in a black and white photograph, but they stylized it in order to take away from precisely the dynamic you're talking about.
So can I just ask a quick follow-up?
Yep.
Yeah. So why did you choose those pictures, like, and not include some non-conventional yoga bodies?
Well, again, partly it was so there's two reasons. One is that some of those postures are difficult for people to do unless you've been practicing for a long time. And most people who've been practicing for a long time, this is one of the offshoots of yoga is it does tend to change your body. That's
Mhm.
A. And B, the people in my studio who were the ones available for the pictures, all the ones who can do all of the postures that are in the book look like this. So yeah. If that had even been an option, I would have considered it, but it's not even an option here.
Which is very interesting to me.
Yep, totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Thanks.
No, no, yeah,
Thanks,
absolutely.
Paul. Thanks,
Yep.
Paul.
David?
Thanks, Paul. It's interesting. This is the first time I've heard you talk about your book, at least formally. But
Well, that's true. That's true.
unlike the infinite number of times informally, uh, you know, I'm really interested in this. It seems to me what you're like. Yoga studios are two things. They're this place where people escape, as you call it, the loud, fast, dirty world, but they're also in and of the loud, fast, dirty world, right? I mean, yoga studios are almost all commercial enterprises, right? And they operate in a free market system. They have to attract students, and so they never escape the world that they promise students they can escape, right? I mean, students
Yep.
escape without escaping.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering if you talk about that fact that yeah, they want to escape the system, but they're in the system. And how does that impact how they operate and how people inside the studios think about their experience?
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. Yeah, that little excerpt I read where I said, this is what the yoga studios, whether you're in Germany or Canada, it promises you this kind of uniform, clean, quiet, space. But nonetheless, the loud, dirty world follows you there, I think is how I put it in the excerpt I read. And yeah, it follows you there in the sense that it can be expensive. It's if you break it down per hour, it's not that expensive actually, but it's certainly that's the story of yoga is that it's expensive. And you have all kinds of issues around, I guess, what we would call the discourse of authenticity, that are very strong there. So there's all kinds of references to India as the kind of authenticating space, the authenticating nation, which requires, in some cases, people to be a bit soft on kind of quasi like populist Indian populism or Hindutva. So there's a way in which a particular kind of nationalism shows up there. There's a way in which the so-called apolitical nature of yoga spaces allows for people to not talk about Indigenous reconciliation or African American issues in the United States, especially. So there's a way in which that filters out certain kinds of debates. Um, so yeah, and certainly one of the interesting things, though, of course, is patriarchy it has been the most severely problematized of all the bad isms and ologies that we might talk about, in the sense that these spaces are mostly run by and for women now. It wasn't always the case, and certainly for the vast majority of Indian history, these were practices made by for men. The whole body that was imagined as a yoga practitioner was always the male body. Several postures will say, bring your heels toward your testicles. They don't make any effort to even be generic. Just bring your heels toward your testicles. And so when I'm teaching yoga, and people will be in a seated posture, and I'll say, okay, bring your heels, and then I'll actually say, do you know what? In most yoga texts and for most yoga history, I would say testicles right now, but I don't. And this reminds you that how dramatically things have changed. So there's a way in which there's been some success on patriarchal norms in yoga spaces because they're by and for women. It's about 80% women in most studios, give or take a little bit. And so, yeah, absolutely, the outside world follows you there, and capitalism certainly does follow you there. In our survey, it was pretty clear that that the serious practitioners who answered our survey were above average education, above average incomes, whiter, and again, about 80% women. So yeah, for sure, everything follows you there.
Yeah. I wonder more subtly, something like American pragmatism, where the value of a practice isn't in the truth of it, but rather in what it does for you. So
Hmm.
that would also explain why people are less interested in the grand claims of levitation and making yourself invisible, these kind of impossible things, and more interested in the kind of psychological and physical well-being,
Yeah,
which is kind of a very pragmatic thing that is a product of our kind of society. So,
yeah, absolutely.
really
And
interesting.
which is why, I pivoted from thinking about nationalism, Canadian American nationalisms, to thinking about the body, the sort of imperiled body, because that was a story I kept hearing was people saying, well, I don't really know very much about Hinduism or Buddhism. I know this worked because I was in a car accident, or I was a
Yeah.
sexual abuse survivor, or I have depression, or I was very, very overweight, or whatever. And I had all these things I brought with me to the studio, and only this practice sort of fixed these things. Um, so yeah, it's a kind of a therapeutic individualism at work, I think, as well. And so people aren't troubled by seeking a sort of a systematic theology. I mean, that of course doesn't make it all that unusual. People in Christianity, in Christian groups, also aren't troubled by systematic theologies. It's only, I shouldn't say only. It's mainly white elite men who are overly concerned about. Wait a second, does the Trinity contradict this other thing? That's a concern for theologians, not actual ordinary folks in the pews, right? Same thing in yoga studios. They're not concerned about, they think they're not concerned about ideology, and certainly not concerned about cultural appropriation, which most of them think they found some way to resolve. It really just, that was one of the questions that fell flat. Every time I would bring it up, they would kind of go, yeah, well, I'm good with it. It's like, no, no, come on. And I would bring it up again. And by the third time I would bring it up, it was pretty clear there's just like no traction. And so you have to be able to um, take a hint that people didn't seem all that fussed by it. I was way more fussed by it than they were, and so yeah, I had to kind of just give that up.
All right. Well, we are at 3:30. I think if it's okay, Paul, do you mind if I ask one kind of questions? I mean,
Of course.
I've just been sort of thinking. I mean, in a way, I'm not really sure what the exact question is, but I'll try and get it. So I'm sort of interested in, broadly speaking, kind of your motivation for writing the book. And in that, I'm also kind of tying in like what you, this is probably a crude question, but sort of what you'd like sort of readers to take away from it. I guess I'm mindful that this is a book that kind of spans different conversations, and that can be challenging for any author, right? Because on one hand, you could say that you've got the religious studies folks in one ear who are sort of, clamoring about certain questions about authenticity and appropriation and so on. And then you have maybe sociologists of religion who are interested in, is this a religious revival? Is this really just a secular thing, right? How do we think about this vis-a-vis wider kind of social changes? And then there's the practitioner conversation about like, how should we think about ourselves? And I'm curious, like, were any of those more important to you? How do you see yourself speaking to each of those groups? Do you see different messages being offered to each of those groups? And how would you articulate those messages?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. That was my fundamental challenge, Galen, in some sense, is that I am trying to speak to all of the above. Um, and so, as you can imagine, the challenge there is how do you make it um, interesting enough for an ordinary practitioner? I mean, most ordinary practitioners aren't going to read it, but the curious ones are the ones who are educated and who are already reading yoga books. They might pick it up. So how do you make it interesting enough for them at the narrative level that they might want to enter into questions about secularization or disenchantment, or they might want to enter into questions about how India is imagined in Yogalands. But then how do I make it interesting enough for you and Ryan and Sarah that you might also be curious about the kind of life history component of it? So how do I sort of say, look, I am interested in questions about religion, spirituality, secularization, the authenticity, the discourse of authenticity. I am interested enough there, and there's enough content for you folks that the other stuff you might get about the kind of memoir quality of it or the life history quality of it might also thicken your understanding of those more kind of academic considerations. There are, I think, 220 endnotes. So people who are, and you're in them, I think, Galen. I don't know if you found yourself yet. So there are enough endnotes that scholar people, whether they're yoga scholars or religion scholars, if they want to pursue things in the academic literature that I'm leaning on, they can do that. But what I didn't want to do is cram every chapter with parenthetical references or big chunky quotations from our crew, which would be a real turnoff to the ordinary reader. And that was something that, I really was wringing my hands about quite a bit before I started. And
I guess
I got
sorry, Paul.
I got some advice from people we all know, Francis Landy and Rebecca King. I took them out to the AAR when we were at the AAR, and I just said, "Hey, do you have any advice about how to handle precisely the question you just raised, Galen?" And they just said, "Well, just sit down and start writing and see how it feels. See how it feels, and start addressing, let's say, a question around secularization or nationalism or whatever, and see if you can do that in a way that your teacher, one of the women in the pictures, might actually be able to get, and then see how it feels, to be speaking to Chris Miller and tell a yoga story, and see if it might bug him." So it's asking a lot, but so far the early responses have been very encouraging from both scholar people and practitioners. So it's got nice blurbs by Andrea Jane and Anya Foxon, who are pretty serious scholars, and also good reviews from practitioner folks.
It occurred to me, sorry, I realize we're over time, but it just occurred to me that, I mean, maybe what I was also trying to get at was that you could imagine that, like, in trying to sort of hold these different groups in conversation, that the takeaways could be different, but equally kind of generative. So, like, this would be a very kind of, again, simplistic way of putting it, but sort of like to the practitioners, it's something like, it's more political than you realize. Look at what these scholars are saying, right? But then to the scholars, say something like, look, it's not just about politics. There's also, people's, cares and commitments and bodies on the line, right? And then to the, so you could imagine how bringing these different conversations together would actually be the thing that allows them to see their blind spots, so to speak, right?
Yeah, totally. In some sense, what I'm really encouraging is greater curiosity about this thing which is in the public arena, right? That I think a lot of folks have made up their minds about yoga already, positively or negatively. And I want practitioners who just think yoga is, simple and clean and lovely to realize it's actually, there's a lot of turtles down there. So, and for scholars who just think, it's just this silly thing that white women do. It's only for super fit, rich, middle class white women. It's like, well, actually, hang on a sec. It's more complicated. Those super fit women in those pictures each have a trauma history of one kind or another. That was the most reliable thing that I got in every interview, was a different kind of trauma history. And so to create enough curiosity in the mind of the scholar that they pay attention to what's keeping people's stories together.
That's fantastic. Thank you. Well, in that case, I think we're going to close it there. I want to thank you again, Paul, on behalf of the Institute, myself, Carol Ann, and Sarah. And yeah, I guess for those of you who are interested in buying the book, we have put in a 25% discount in the chat, so it's available. Good. And Paul is, of course, the director for the Center for the Study of Religion and Society at UVic. So if you have questions about that, I'm sure he'd be happy to answer them if you want to reach out to him or anyone at the center. And with that, we'll just thank everybody for coming, and stay tuned. We'll have more events planned for the upcoming fall term.
I guess I'll see some of you in Toronto at the CSSR panel, but maybe not. But all right. Take care, everybody.